June 23, 1941. 3:15 a.m. The Soviet-German border. The silence over the sleeping Soviet airfields was shattered by the screams of Junker's U-87 Stuka dive bombers. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed over 200 Soviet aircraft, most of them burned on the ground before their pilots could even reach the flight line. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun with overwhelming force. The Nazi war machine, fresh from conquering Poland, France, and the Balkans, seemed unstoppable. By December 1941, German forces were at the gates of Moscow. The Soviet Air Force had been decimated. Thousands of pilots were dead, captured, or missing. Aircraft production struggled to replace losses that mounted by the hundreds each week. The situation was desperate. But in that desperation, something unprecedented was about to emerge. Something the German pilots, with all their experience and tactical brilliance, could never have imagined. Women were about to take to the skies, not as ferry pilots or support crew, but as combat aviators flying night bombing missions over German lines. They would become the most feared nocturnal threat the Wehrmacht ever faced. The Germans would call them Nachthexen, the night witches. Marina Raskova was already a legend in Soviet aviation before the war began. At 28 years old, she had set multiple long-distance flight records, navigated the first all-female crew across Siberia to the Pacific, and survived a crash landing in the taiga wilderness that made her a hero of the Soviet Union. Stalin himself knew her name. When she called, the Kremlin listened. In September 1941, with Moscow under siege and the Soviet Union bleeding from 1,000 wounds, Raskova proposed something radical. 3 entire regiments of female combat pilots, not support units, not auxiliary forces, combat squadrons that would fly bombing and fighter missions alongside their male counterparts. The proposal was met with exactly the resistance you'd expect. Soviet military commanders, even desperate ones, balked at the idea. Women pilots were fine for propaganda photos and ferry work, but combat, against the battle-hardened Luftwaffe, it was madness. But Marina Raskova had 2 things working in her favor. First, the Soviet Union was losing the war badly enough that any idea, no matter how radical, deserved consideration. Second, she had Stalin's ear. On October 8, 1941, Joseph Stalin signed Order 0099, authorizing the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. That last unit, the 508th, would become the Night Witches. The call went out across the Soviet Union. Women with any flying experience, any technical knowledge, any desire to fight were invited to volunteer. The response was overwhelming. Over 2,000 women applied. Mechanics, engineers, students, factory workers, even teenagers who had learned to fly in civilian aviation clubs. They came from Moscow and Leningrad, from collective farms in Ukraine, from villages in Siberia. They came because their country was dying, and they refused to watch from the ground. The selection was brutal. Only the best would be accepted, only those who could endure. By the time training began at the Engels Military Aviation School, 400 women had been selected. They ranged in age from 17 to 26. Many had never seen combat. Few had any military training. None of them knew what was coming. What was coming was the Polikarpov PO-2. Imagine the worst possible aircraft for combat operations. Something slow, fragile, unarmed. Now make it worse. Make it a biplane designed in 1928 for crop dusting and pilot training. Construct it from plywood and canvas. Give it an open cockpit with no heating, no armor, no instruments beyond the most basic compass and altimeter. Equip it with a 100-horsepower engine that could barely push the aircraft to 94 miles per hour at maximum speed. This was the Polikarpov Po-2, the aircraft that would strike terror into German hearts. When the women of the 588th Regiment first saw their assigned aircraft, the reactions ranged from disbelief to despair. Nadezhda Popova, who would become one of the most decorated night witches, recalled the moment decades later. "I thought someone was playing a cruel joke. These were training aircraft, obsolete even before the war. They were held together with wire and prayers. The wings were fabric stretched over wooden frames. You could punch through them with your fist." Senior Lieutenant Irina Rakobolskaya, the regiment's chief of staff, remembered the technical briefing. Maximum speed 94 miles per hour, service ceiling 10,000 feet, range 280 miles, bomb load 770 pounds, defensive armament none. The specifications were medieval compared to German aircraft. We were being sent to war in museum pieces. But Marina Raskova and her deputy commander, Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, understood something the skeptics didn't. The PO-2's weaknesses could become weapons in the right circumstances. The aircraft was so slow that German fighters couldn't engage it effectively. Their stall speed exceeded the PO-2's maximum velocity. If a Messerschmitt Bf 109 tried to intercept a PO-2, it would simply stall and fall from the sky before it could match speeds. The plywood and canvas construction, so fragile in daylight combat, made the aircraft nearly invisible to radar. The engine was so quiet that ground forces couldn't hear it until bombs were already falling. And the simplicity of the design meant it could be repaired with materials available at any forward airfield. Mechanics could patch bullet holes with dope and fabric, replace damaged wings in hours, rebuild entire aircraft from salvaged parts. Training began in November 1941. The women learned to fly in conditions that would have grounded experienced pilots. They flew without lights, using only moonlight and landmarks for navigation. They practiced bombing runs at treetop level. They learned to fly in formation with no communication beyond hand signals, and they discovered the PO-2's most terrifying capability, silent flight. By cutting the engine and gliding over the target, a PO-2 could approach in near-complete silence. The only sound was the wind through the wing braces, a soft whooshing noise that German soldiers would learn to associate with incoming death. Ground forces reported hearing nothing until the bombs exploded. One moment, silence. The next, hell. The Germans would describe it as a witch's broom sweeping through the night sky. The name stuck. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew its first combat mission on June 8, 1942. The target was a German forward headquarters near the front lines south of Rostov-on-Don. The flight consisted of 8 PO-2s, each loaded with 4 110-pound bombs. The pilots were terrified, but determined. Senior Lieutenant Polina Gelman, who would eventually fly 860 combat missions, was on that first raid. Her recollection was vivid. "We flew in complete darkness, no lights on the aircraft, no lights on the ground to guide us, just darkness and fear. I remember gripping the stick so hard my hands cramped. The engine sound seemed impossibly loud. Surely the Germans would hear us coming." But they didn't. The formation approached the target at 3,000 feet, navigating by dead reckoning and the burning villages below. A quarter-mile from the target, the lead pilot cut her engine. The others followed. 8 biplanes glided silently through the night, the only sound the whisper of wind through canvas and wire. The German headquarters had no warning. Guards stood at their posts, unaware that death approached from above. Officers worked by lamplight in wooden buildings, planning the next day's offensive. Supply trucks idled in the compound, their engines masking any sound from above. Then the bombs fell. 44 bombs in less than a minute. The headquarters compound erupted in flame and chaos. Ammunition stored in tents detonated. Fuel trucks exploded. The wooden buildings were shredded by blast and shrapnel. German soldiers ran screaming into the night, some on fire, others torn by fragments, all of them terrorized by an enemy they couldn't see or hear until the bombs were already falling. The PO-2s banked away, restarted their engines, and disappeared into the darkness. Not a single aircraft was lost. The night witches had drawn first blood. The 588th quickly developed tactics that maximized their aircraft's strange advantages. The standard mission profile was simple but brutally effective. Small formations, typically 3 aircraft, would approach the target area at altitude. When they reached the attack position, the formation would split up. The first aircraft would dive toward the target with its engine at full throttle, deliberately attracting attention. German anti-aircraft batteries would open fire, tracers lighting up the night sky. Searchlights would sweep upward, seeking the intruder. The noise and light show would be tremendous. While every German gun was pointed at the decoy, the second PO2 would cut its engine and glide silently to the target from a different direction. In the darkness and confusion, with all attention focused elsewhere, this aircraft would release its bombs and disappear before anyone realized it was there. As the Germans redirected their fire toward where the second aircraft had been, the third PO2 would attack from yet another angle, also in silent flight. By the time the anti-aircraft crews understood what was happening, all 3 aircraft were gone, leaving only fire and corpses behind. The regiment would repeat this process 8, 10, 12 times per night. The same crew would land, reload bombs and fuel, and take off again within minutes. Some pilots flew as many as 15 missions in a single night. The Germans called it the Night Harassment Campaign, a deliberately bland name for an experience that was driving their soldiers insane. Nadezhda Popova described the physical toll. "We would fly until we couldn't keep our eyes open. Land, reload, take off. Land, reload, take off. I once flew 18 missions in one night. When I finally climbed out of the cockpit at dawn, I couldn't remember half of them. My navigator had to tell me where we'd been and what we'd hit. I was a zombie, we all were." But the Germans had it worse. Wehrmacht soldiers at the front learned to dread the sound of that whispering wind. Unlike artillery, which followed predictable patterns, the night witches could strike anywhere, any time, from any direction. There was no safe area behind the front lines. Headquarters, supply depots, troop concentrations, artillery positions, all were vulnerable. Sleep became impossible. The psychological toll was devastating. German soldiers started calling them things other than night witches. Some units called them Stalin's angels, others called them the night swallows, a few called them Satan's sisters, but every name carried the same tone of exhausted terror. These weren't normal pilots. They were something worse, something that hunted in the darkness and couldn't be stopped. The reality of life in the 588th Regiment was harsh beyond imagination. The Po-2s had open cockpits. In summer, pilots endured mosquitoes, heat, and smoke from burning targets. In winter, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia killed more than one pilot before the regiment learned to stuff their flight suits with newspaper for insulation. The aircraft had no parachutes in the early months. There wasn't room for them, and the bombs both. A direct hit or catastrophic mechanical failure meant death. No ejection, no bailout. Just a flaming descent into German-occupied territory. Navigation was primitive. They flew by memorizing landmarks, following rivers and roads, counting seconds between known points. On moonless nights or when clouds obscured the ground, pilots navigating entirely by compass and stopwatch, hoping their dead reckoning was accurate. Many missions ended with crews wandering the darkness, lost, praying they didn't accidentally land behind German lines. Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Zhigulenko, later a hero of the Soviet Union, described a typical mission night. "We would brief at dusk, 20, 30 crews in a freezing tent, marking targets on maps we'd memorized. Then we'd walk to the aircraft. The mechanics, also women, would have them ready. Bombs loaded, fuel topped off, engines warmed. We'd climb in, strap in, and take off into the darkness. The flight to the target was always the worst part. Not the bombing run, not the return, the flight out, when you knew what was coming. German searchlights would appear on the horizon. Then flak would start, orange tracers rising like slow-motion fireworks. You'd pick your attack angle, cut the engine, and glide in. Everything silent except wind and your own heartbeat. The bombs were released manually, a lever by the navigator's position. You'd count down, 3, 2, 1, release. Then you'd feel the aircraft jump as the weight came off. You'd wait for the explosion below. If you'd calculated correctly, you'd see fire. If you'd miscalculated, you'd see nothing and realize you'd just wasted 4 bombs. Then the hardest part, restarting the engine in a glide, sometimes with flak exploding around you. The Po-2 engine was temperamental in the best conditions. In combat, with adrenaline shaking your hands, with searchlights blinding you, with tracers reaching up, you had to remain calm enough to follow the starting procedure exactly. Because if the engine didn't catch, you were gliding down into German territory with no power and no chance of survival. When the engine caught and roared to life, the relief was overwhelming. You'd bank hard, staying low, using every bit of darkness and terrain to hide. Then you'd fly back to base, land, and do it all again, and again, and again. The casualty rate was staggering. In 4 years of combat operations, the 588th Regiment lost 32 pilots and navigators killed in action out of approximately 260 who served. That's a 12% fatality rate, not counting wounded or aircraft lost to accidents. To put that in perspective, Bomber Command of the RAF had a 44% fatality rate. The Night Witches were facing similar odds in aircraft that made British bombers look like fortresses. By late 1942, the Night Witches had become a serious problem for German forces on the Eastern Front. Luftwaffe commanders received increasingly desperate reports from ground units. Anti-aircraft batteries were firing thousands of rounds per night and hitting nothing. The slow, low-flying biplanes were nearly impossible to track. By the time searchlights found them, they were already gone. The Germans tried everything. They reinforced anti-aircraft batteries, deployed additional searchlights, even tried using interceptor fighters at night. Nothing worked consistently. Fast fighters couldn't catch the Po-2s without stalling. The biplanes flew too low for effective radar tracking. And their wood and canvas construction created minimal infrared signature, making heat-seeking difficult even with primitive night vision equipment. Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Kroschinski, a Luftwaffe night fighter pilot with Nachtjagdgeschwader 100, wrote in his diary about an attempted intercept in March 1943. Received word of intruders over our forward positions. Took off in the Bf-110, hoping for easy kills. What a fool I was. We located them by the fires they'd started. 3 aircraft, slow biplanes, circling like vultures. I approached from above and behind, perfect position. Reduced throttle to minimum speed, dropped flaps, everything to slow down enough to engage. Still too fast. Flew past them like they were hovering. Absurd. Attempted a second pass, this time even slower. My engines were barely keeping me aloft. Got one in my sights and fired. Missed. The tracers went right through where it should have been, but it had slipped sideways, some kind of maneuver I've never seen. By the time I'd corrected, I was below stall speed. Had to firewall the throttles and pull up hard to avoid slamming into the ground. They disappeared into the darkness while I was recovering. I'd fired over 200 rounds and hit nothing. My gunner said he thought the aircraft were ghosts. I almost believed him. How do you fight something that moves like that? The psychological effect on German ground troops was even worse. Wehrmacht soldiers, tough veterans who had survived the Eastern Front's horrors, were being driven to the edge by these nightly attacks. Sleep deprivation, constant fear, the humiliation of being unable to stop these primitive aircraft, all combined to create a crisis in morale. A captured German report from the 134th Infantry Division, dated October 1942, described the situation. Night operations have become impossible. Enemy harassment bombers, identified as obsolete biplanes flown by female crews, attack continuously from dusk to dawn. Artillery batteries report being unable to remain in position due to accurate bombing. Supply convoys refuse to move at night. Troop morale is severely affected. The psychological impact exceeds the physical damage. These attacks cause minimal casualties individually, but the cumulative effect is devastating. Soldiers are exhausted, nerves frayed. Some men have begun reporting sick rather than face another night on the line. Officers request permission to withdraw to defensive positions further from the front. Request is denied. The German High Command's response was to offer rewards for shooting down the Night Witches. Any German pilot, fighter, or anti-aircraft gunner who could confirm destroying one of these biplanes would receive an immediate Iron Cross. The reward was unprecedented. An Iron Cross, normally earned through months of distinguished service, was being offered for a single kill. It didn't help. The Night Witches were too good, their tactics too refined, their aircraft too difficult to intercept. The reward went largely unclaimed. The women of the 588th weren't superhuman. They were scared, exhausted, traumatized by the violence they witnessed and inflicted. But they were also determined, skilled, and bound together by a camaraderie forged in shared danger. Nadezhda Popova, one of the regiment's most decorated pilots, flew 852 combat missions. Her aircraft was shot down multiple times. She was nearly killed by German fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and mechanical failures. Her husband, also a pilot, was killed in combat, but she kept flying. In a post-war interview, she described what sustained her. "I was angry at what the Germans had done to my country, angry at the death and destruction. Every bombing run was revenge for the villages they'd burned, the people they'd murdered. I wasn't a soldier. I was fury with wings." Yevgenia Zhigulenko flew 825 missions. She was shot down twice, crash-landed 3 times, and once made it back to base with her aircraft so damaged that it was immediately scrapped. She earned the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, her country's highest honor. But in her memoirs, she didn't write about the heroism. She wrote about the fear. People think we were fearless. We weren't. Every night, walking to the aircraft, my legs would shake. Sometimes I'd have to grab onto something to steady myself. The fear never went away. You just learned to function despite it, to strap yourself into an unarmored aircraft and fly into a sky filled with tracers and explosions. You did it because someone had to, because if you didn't, the Germans would win. Irina Sabrova flew 1,008 combat missions, more than any other female pilot in history. Think about that number, over 1,000 trips into German fire, 1,000 times returning to reload and do it again. She flew so many missions that her navigator, Nadezhda Popova, kept a running count because Sabrova herself lost track. Not all the stories ended well. Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Rudneva, the regiment's navigator and an astronomy student before the war, was killed on April 9, 1944, during the liberation of Kerch. Her aircraft took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire during her 645th mission. She was 23 years old. Serafima Amosova-Taranenko, who had flown 810 missions, was shot down by German fighters in August 1944. She was 20. Yevdokia Nosal, a squadron commander with over 350 missions, was killed by ground fire in June 1943. She was 23. For every ace who survived, there was a teenager who didn't make it home. The Night Witches paid their dues in blood and fear. They earned their reputation through sacrifice that should never be forgotten. By 1943, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had become an integral part of Soviet military operations. Their nocturnal harassment forced German units to spread anti-aircraft defenses thin, allowed Soviet artillery to move freely at night, and prevented enemy forces from achieving any rest or security in rear areas. At the Battle of Caucasus, Night Witches flew continuous missions supporting the Soviet counteroffensive. At the Taman Peninsula, they pounded German defensive positions night after night, wearing down defenders who had no respite from the constant attacks. At the Siege of Novorossiysk, they provided the night bombing that allowed Soviet naval infantry to establish a beachhead. But their finest hour came during the liberation of Crimea in April and May 1944. The Germans had fortified the Crimean Peninsula with extensive defenses. Luftwaffe units based there threatened Soviet supply lines. The campaign to liberate Crimea would require months of brutal fighting. The Night Witches were there every night. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander, coordinated with Soviet ground forces to provide what modern militaries would call close air support. As Soviet infantry advanced, Po-2s would attack German positions ahead of them. When advances stalled, the Night Witches would pound defensive strong points. When German reinforcements tried to move forward, the biplanes would interdict their routes. Nadezhda Popova described the Crimean campaign. "We flew until we couldn't see straight. 4, 5, 6 missions per night became routine. We'd land, refuel, and rearm in 20 minutes and take off again. The mechanics were working miracles. We'd land with aircraft shot full of holes, and they'd patch them with fabric and glue while we grabbed whatever food we could. The Germans knew we were coming every night. They'd fire everything they had into the sky. The whole horizon would light up with tracers. It was like flying into a fireworks display where every firework was trying to kill you. We lost aircraft. We lost friends. But we kept flying because the alternative was letting the fascists win." The 588th flew over 23,000 sorties during the Crimean campaign, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German positions. The constant harassment prevented German forces from achieving any operational coordination at night. Supply lines were disrupted. Communications were severed. Morale collapsed. When Soviet forces finally broke through German defenses and liberated Sevastopol in May 1944, the Night Witches had flown more combat missions than any other unit involved. Their contribution was undeniable. In February 1943, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The Guards designation was the highest honor in the Soviet military, reserved for units that had distinguished themselves in combat. It came with increased pay, better supplies, and official recognition of their contributions. But recognition didn't make the missions safer. As the Soviet Union pushed westward, liberating occupied territory and advancing into German-held Europe, the Night Witches went with them. New targets, new dangers, new losses. By 1944, individual Night Witches were earning the highest Soviet decorations. 23 women from the regiment would eventually receive the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. Dozens more earned the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of Glory, and other combat decorations. But medals didn't replace lost friends. Decorations didn't heal the psychological wounds of combat. The women who survived carried scars that no amount of official recognition could erase. Raisa Aronova, who flew 960 combat missions, later described the cost. "We smiled for the propaganda cameras. We accepted our medals with pride. But at night we dreamed of falling, of fire, of friends screaming in burning aircraft. The war ended in 1945. The nightmares never did." The strain showed in small ways. Pilots would count missions obsessively, terrified that losing count would somehow curse them. Navigators developed rituals before flights, touching certain parts of the aircraft in specific orders. Everyone had a lucky charm, a photo, a letter, something to hold on to when rationality failed. Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Krutikova, a veteran of 725 missions, kept a diary throughout the war. An entry from October 1944 revealed the toll. "Flew 6 missions last night. Don't remember 3 of them. Landed, reloaded, took off. Automatic, like a machine. That's what we've become. Flying machines that happen to have hearts still beating inside them. When the war ends, if I survive, will I remember how to be human again?" As the Soviet Union advanced into Poland, Hungary, and finally Germany itself in 1944 and 1945, the Night Witches went with them. Their missions became more dangerous as they flew over unfamiliar terrain, faced increased anti-aircraft defenses, and encountered the fanatical resistance of German forces fighting on their own soil. The 46th Guards Regiment participated in the liberation of Poland, flying support missions for the Vistula-Oder offensive. They bombed German positions during the siege of Budapest. They harassed German forces retreating through East Prussia. And finally, they flew missions over Germany itself. Senior Lieutenant Polina Gelman, by then a veteran of over 850 missions, remembered flying over Berlin in April 1945. The city was already burning, thousands of fires from conventional bombing raids. We added our small contribution, bombing a German artillery position near Spandau. It was strange, flying over the enemy capital. After years of defending our homeland, we were finally taking the war to them. But there was no joy in it, just exhaustion, just the desire for it to be over. We'd been at war for 4 years. We'd seen too much death, inflicted too much destruction. We weren't the same women who had volunteered in 1941. Those young, idealistic girls were gone. We'd become something harder, something necessary but damaged. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment flew its last combat mission on May 4, 1945, 4 days before Germany's surrender. The target was a German strongpoint near Swinemünde. 8 Po-2s, flying their 1,000th mission of the war, dropped their bombs and returned safely. It was an unremarkable end to a remarkable story. When the war ended on May 9, 1945, the Night Witches had flown 23,672 combat sorties. They had dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on German forces. They had participated in every major Soviet offensive from 1942 to 1945. They had earned 23 Hero of the Soviet Union medals, the highest number for any female unit in history. But the cost was visible in their faces. The young women who had volunteered in 1941 had aged decades. They had survived, but they had left pieces of themselves scattered across 1,000 German targets. After the war ended, the women of the 46th Guards Regiment returned to civilian life. They became teachers, engineers, doctors, factory workers. They married, raised children, built the peace they had fought to secure. But they carried the war with them. Soviet authorities, initially proud of the female combat aviators, became uncomfortable with their story as the political winds shifted. Women were supposed to return to traditional roles. The idea of female combat pilots, while heroic during wartime, didn't fit post-war society's image of proper Soviet womanhood. The Night Witches were quietly written out of many official histories. Their combat records were minimized or attributed to male units. Requests for post-war recognition went unanswered. The women who had terrified the Wehrmacht were expected to fade into obscurity. Many did. They lived quiet lives, never speaking about their experiences. The psychological toll of combat, combined with societal pressure to forget, meant that an entire generation of female combat veterans simply stopped talking about the war. But some refused to be silent. Nadezhda Popova spent decades after the war speaking to schools, veterans groups, anyone who would listen. She wanted young people to understand what war really meant. Not glory, not adventure, but fear, death, and loss on a scale that should never be repeated. Yevgenia Zhigulenko became a film director, making movies about aviation and the war. Her 1981 film, Night Witches, was the first major Soviet film to accurately portray the 46th Guards Regiment's story. Irina Rakobolskaya, the regiment's chief of staff, spent years compiling a complete record of every woman who served in the unit. She tracked down survivors, collected photographs, preserved combat reports. Her book, published in 1986, ensured that the Night Witches' story would survive even as the veterans themselves aged. The last surviving Night Witch, Nadezhda Popova, died in 2013, at age 91. With her passing, the living memory of those desperate nights over German lines finally faded. But the legend lives on. Today, military historians recognize the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment as one of the most effective harassment bomber units of World War II. Their tactics, developed out of necessity with obsolete aircraft, influenced post-war thinking about asymmetric warfare and unconventional operations. The Po-2 biplane, that ridiculous wood and canvas relic, proved that innovative tactics and skilled pilots could overcome technological disadvantage. The Night Witches demonstrated that courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about functioning despite terror. about climbing into an open cockpit night after night, knowing the odds and flying anyway. At the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, a restored PO-2 hangs from the ceiling, its fabric wings still bearing patch marks from bullet holes. Below it is a display of photographs, young women in flight suits, smiling at the camera. Their average age was 22. Most weren't old enough to drink in some countries. But they were old enough to fight, old enough to die, old enough to become legends. A plaque beneath the display quotes Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander. "We flew through hell every night. We lost friends to fire and steel. We lived with fear as a constant companion. But we never quit. We never surrendered. Because our motherland needed us, and we would not let her down." German veterans, interviewed decades after the war, still spoke of the Night Witches with a mixture of respect and remembered fear. Hauptmann Hans-Georg Bacher, who served as an anti-aircraft battery commander on the Eastern Front, was recorded in 1987 at age 72. 60 years have passed, and I still remember that sound. The whisper of wind through their wing braces. We called it the Night Witch's broom. When you heard it, you knew bombs were coming. We fired thousands of rounds into the darkness and hit nothing. They were ghosts, deadly, terrifying ghosts. After the war, I learned they were women. Young women, many of them teenagers. I couldn't believe it. The pilots who had made veteran soldiers dive for cover every night were girls flying training aircraft. If someone had told me during the war, I would have called them insane. Now I think it's the most remarkable military achievement I've ever heard of. They had nothing but courage and obsolete biplanes. They turned it into a weapon that no army could stop. The history of World War II aviation is dominated by two sounds: the roar of powerful engines, Pratt & Whitney double Wasps, Rolls-Royce Merlins, BMW radials, massive power plants driving aircraft through the sky with overwhelming force. The P-47 Thunderbolt, whose story inspired this telling, exemplified that philosophy. Brute power, overwhelming firepower, industrial might made manifest in aluminum and steel. But there was another sound, a whisper, the soft rush of wind through canvas and wire, the Night Witch's broom sweeping through German skies. A sound that proved you didn't need overwhelming power to be overwhelming. Sometimes innovation and courage could match any advantage in raw strength. The P-47 pilots had 8 synchronized Browning machine guns, 2,000 horsepower, and the full might of American industry behind them. The Night Witches had 4 bombs, 100 horsepower, and aircraft held together with fabric glue and determination. Both wrote their names in history. Both struck terror into enemy hearts. One roared into battle like thunder. The other whispered in like a ghost. Both were unstoppable. The German pilots who faced both threats offered the ultimate assessment. Captured Luftwaffe reports from 1944 listed the 2 most feared Allied aircraft. Number 1 was the P-47 Thunderbolt, whose concentrated firepower could destroy any German aircraft caught in its sights. Number 2 was the PO-2 biplane flown by the Night Witches, whose psychological effect exceeded its physical destructive power. A 1928 crop duster and training plane, flown by young women with courage that exceeded any technological advantage, had earned a place alongside the most powerful fighter bomber ever built. That tells you everything you need to know about the Night Witches. By May 1945, the thunder of the Thunderbolt's guns and the whisper of the Night Witch's wings had both fallen silent. The war was over. The victories were won. The surviving pilots returned home, carried their memories, and tried to build peace from the ashes of war. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through trees just right, some people say you can still hear it. The ghost of that sound, the whisper of canvas wings and wire braces, the Night Witch's broom sweeping through eternity. They came from civilian life. They flew obsolete aircraft. They had no armor, no guns, no respect from their enemies, until the bombs started falling. Then they had all the respect in the world. Because respect in war isn't earned through technology or firepower alone. It's earned through effectiveness, and the Night Witches were devastatingly effective. Let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that even the most dramatic narrative can't fully capture. 23,672 combat sorties. That's the official count, but consider what each sortie meant. A takeoff in darkness from a primitive airfield, navigation by compass and landmarks over enemy territory, approach to a defended target while anti-aircraft batteries filled the sky with steel, the release of bombs while searchlights tried to blind you and tracers reached up like deadly fingers, the escape, the return flight, the landing on a blacked-out runway, and then doing it all again and again. The 46th Guards Regiment averaged 8 sorties per aircraft per night. Some nights they flew 15. The ground crews performed maintenance miracles. Mechanics would patch bullet holes, replace damaged control cables, refuel and rearm an aircraft in 20 minutes. Then watch it take off into the darkness, never certain it would return. Over 3,000 tons of bombs dropped. Each PO2 carried 770 pounds maximum. That's roughly 6 bombs per mission. Simple division tells you those 23,672 sorties delivered approximately 142,000 individual bombs onto German positions, each one aimed by hand, each one released manually, each one guided only by the pilot's skill and the navigator's calculations. But the physical damage was only part of the story. The psychological impact was immeasurable. How do you quantify sleep deprivation? How do you calculate the combat effectiveness loss when soldiers are too exhausted and terrified to function properly? How do you measure the morale damage of being unable to stop an enemy you can hear but can't see? German units reported that a single Night Witches raid, even if it caused minimal casualties, would render soldiers unfit for offensive operations the following day. Multiply that by 4 years of nightly attacks. Multiply it by dozens of German divisions across the entire Eastern Front. The cumulative effect was strategic. And the cost. 32 women killed in action, 32 names on a memorial. 32 families receiving notification that their daughter, their sister, their wife would never come home. Each one of those deaths represented hundreds of successful missions before the final flight. Each one was a veteran, not a novice. Experience didn't guarantee survival. But compare those losses to other bomber units. The 46th Guards Regiment had a lower loss rate than virtually any other bomber unit in any Air Force during World War II. The RAF's Bomber Command lost 55,573 air crew, killed out of 125,000 who served, a 44% fatality rate. The U.S. 8th Air Force lost roughly 26,000 air crew. The Night Witches, flying unarmored aircraft on nightly missions over 4 years, achieved a 12% fatality rate. How? Superior tactics? Certainly. The aircraft's unique characteristics? Absolutely, but also something less quantifiable. The women of the 46th Guards were flying for their homeland, for their families, for survival. That motivation created a level of focus and discipline that even the best peacetime training couldn't replicate. Something remarkable happened in the 46th Guards Regiment that rarely occurs in military units. The women formed bonds that transcended normal military camaraderie. They became sisters in the truest sense. In male combat units, there's often competition. Rivalry for promotions, for recognition, for ace status. The Night Witches had none of that. Every pilot celebrated every navigator's success. Every ground crew member took pride in every aircraft that returned safely. When someone was killed, the entire regiment mourned together. Inna Pasportnikova, who served as an armorer with the regiment, recalled the atmosphere decades later. We weren't just serving together, we were family. When Katya's aircraft didn't return, we all cried. When Nadia completed her 500th mission, we all celebrated. There was no jealousy, no pettiness. We understood that survival depended on everyone doing their job perfectly. That created a bond stronger than anything I've experienced since. The pilots and navigators developed partnerships that bordered on telepathic. Flying together night after night in an open cockpit, communicating by hand signals and shouted words over engine noise, they learned to anticipate each other's thoughts. A good crew could execute complex bombing runs with minimal communication. The pilot would feel the navigator's tap on her shoulder and know exactly when to turn, when to dive, when to release. Yevgenia Krutikova and her navigator Inna Zarubina flew together for 3 years. In a post-war interview, Krutikova described their connection. "I could feel when Inna was nervous. She could tell when I was struggling with fatigue. We developed our own language of touches and signals. A tap on the left shoulder meant turn left. 2 taps meant urgent. 3 meant abort. But we rarely needed even that. I'd feel her lean forward, and I'd know she'd spotted the target. I'd bank into the attack run before she even signaled. When she was killed by ground fire in March 1945, I felt like I'd lost part of myself. The regiment assigned me a new navigator, a skilled woman with combat experience. But it wasn't the same. I'd lost my other half. The ground crews developed the same bonds with their flight crews. Each mechanic team was assigned specific aircraft and crews. They took personal responsibility for every aircraft that went out. If it came back damaged, they'd work through the night to repair it. If it didn't come back, they'd grieve and then prepare a replacement aircraft for the surviving crew or new pilots. Sofia Burzaeva, chief mechanic for one of the regiment's squadrons, described the relationship. "I knew every rivet on Nadia's aircraft. I could feel when something was wrong just by listening to the engine. I'd check and recheck everything before she took off. Then I'd stand on the flight line and watch her disappear into the darkness. And I'd pray to gods I didn't believe in that she'd come back. Sometimes aircraft would return so damaged we couldn't understand how they'd stayed in the air. Fabric shredded, control cables half severed, engines that should have seized. But they'd made it home because the pilot refused to quit and because I'd built that aircraft to take punishment. I put my soul into every aircraft I touched. When one didn't come back, I felt like I'd failed, even though I knew it wasn't my fault, even though I'd done everything right. Failure still felt personal. This bond extended to the regiment's commander. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya wasn't a distant authority figure. She flew combat missions alongside her pilots. She knew every woman in the regiment by name. She attended every funeral, wrote every letter to grieving families, and fought with Soviet headquarters for every resource her unit needed. When supplies were short, Bershanskaya gave her rations to younger pilots. When the regiment was denied leave, she personally traveled to Moscow to argue their case. When bureaucrats suggested replacing her combat-weary veterans with fresh pilots, she threatened to resign rather than abandon her women. The pilots worshipped her, not because she was soft or maternal, but because she demanded excellence while genuinely caring about their survival. She never sent anyone on a mission she wouldn't fly herself. She never asked for sacrifices she wasn't willing to make. That kind of leadership creates loyalty that no amount of rank or authority can command. Military theorists have studied the Night Witches extensively because they represent a perfect case study in asymmetric warfare. How does a force with inferior equipment defeat a technologically superior enemy? The answer lies in tactics, innovation, and accepting limitations while maximizing strengths. The Po-2 was inferior to German aircraft in every measurable category: speed, altitude, range, armament, survivability. The Germans had overwhelming advantages, so the Night Witches stopped trying to compete in those categories. Instead, they found dimensions where their aircraft had advantages and exploited them ruthlessly. Stealth. The Po-2's wooden and canvas construction created minimal radar signature. Its quiet engine was difficult to detect. Its ability to fly with the engine off made it nearly silent. The Night Witches turned these characteristics into weapons, developing tactics centered on surprise and confusion rather than firepower. Flexibility. The Po-2 could operate from primitive airfields that would ground more sophisticated aircraft. It could take off and land in spaces barely larger than a football field. It required minimal maintenance and could be repaired with common materials. This meant the Night Witches could operate from forward airfields close to the front lines, reducing flight time to targets and increasing sortie rates. Endurance. While German fighters burned fuel rapidly and could stay airborne for maybe 2 hours, the PO-2's economical engine allowed missions lasting up to 4 hours. This meant Night Witches could loiter over target areas, waiting for the perfect moment to attack, or could strike multiple targets in a single mission. Numbers. The PO-2 was cheap and easy to produce compared to modern combat aircraft. The Soviets built over 40,000 during and after the war. This meant losses could be replaced quickly. It meant multiple units could operate simultaneously. It meant the Germans faced not a few sophisticated bombers they could prioritize defending against, but swarms of simple aircraft attacking everywhere at once. The Night Witches also weaponized psychology. They understood that terror is a force multiplier. The whistling sound of their gliding aircraft became a weapon in itself. German soldiers would hear that whisper and panic before any bombs fell. The Night Witches cultivated this fear deliberately, timing attacks for maximum psychological impact. They'd strike just after soldiers had settled in for the night, preventing sleep. They'd attack the same position repeatedly through the night, creating the impression of endless enemy resources. They'd vary their approach patterns and timing, making their attacks unpredictable. They turned harassment into an art form. Colonel General Heinz Wilhelm Guderian, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, mentioned the Night Witches in his post-war memoirs. These night bombers caused us more damage than any other type of aircraft, not because their bombs were so destructive, individually they weren't, but because their constant presence prevented rest, forced constant alertness, and created psychological strain that degraded combat effectiveness. We had fighters that could fly circles around them. We had anti-aircraft guns that could shoot down entire formations if we could track them, but we couldn't catch what we couldn't see. We couldn't shoot what we couldn't hear. They exploited our weaknesses perfectly while never engaging our strengths. It was brilliant and infuriating. Modern military academies study the Night Witches as an example of how doctrine and tactics can overcome technological disadvantage. Their methods influenced the development of stealth aircraft, special operations aviation, and psychological warfare doctrine. The PO-2 might have been obsolete, but the minds guiding it were generations ahead of their time. Let's be clear about something. The Night Witches' story is inspiring. It's remarkable. It's worthy of every bit of recognition it receives. But it wasn't glorious. War never is. The women who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Chronic frostbite damage from flying in open cockpits at 40 below zero. Hearing loss from engine noise and explosions. Chronic pain from the physical strain of hand-flying primitive aircraft through combat conditions night after night. But the psychological wounds were worse. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't well understood in the 1940s and 50s. Soviet culture didn't acknowledge mental health issues. Veterans were expected to return to normal life without complaint. So the Night Witches suffered in silence. Nadezhda Popova spoke about this in one of her final interviews in 2010. We didn't have therapy. We didn't have counseling. We had nightmares and alcohol. Some of us coped better than others. Some never coped at all. I knew women from the regiment who never married, never had children, never trusted anyone again. The war had hollowed them out and left nothing but survival instinct behind. I was lucky. I found love again after my husband was killed. I built a life. I had children. But even in my happiest moments, part of me was still in that cockpit flying through tracers. Part of me was still watching friends burn. You don't come back from that unchanged. You don't come back whole. Yevgenia Zhigolenko, who became a successful film director after the war, used cinema as therapy. Her films about aviation and combat were attempts to process her experiences. In a 1992 interview, she admitted, "Every film I made was about the war. Even when the subject was different, the themes were the same. Loss, fear, survival. I was trying to understand what we'd done, what had been done to us. I'm not sure I ever succeeded." The Soviet government's treatment of female veterans was complicated. During the war, they were heroes. Propaganda celebrated their courage. Newspapers printed their stories. But after the war, the narrative shifted. Women were expected to return to traditional roles. Female combat veterans didn't fit the peacetime image of Soviet womanhood. Many night witches found it difficult to get jobs despite their military decorations. Employers were uncomfortable with women who had killed. Universities were reluctant to admit female veterans. Society wanted its women to be mothers and workers, not warriors. The very qualities that had made them effective in combat, independence, decisiveness, willingness to take risks, made them suspect in peacetime. Irina Sebrova, holder of the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal and veteran of 1,008 combat missions, worked as a flight instructor after the war. She applied for positions training military pilots but was rejected repeatedly. Her qualifications were impeccable. Her combat record was unmatched. But she was a woman, and Soviet military aviation in peacetime had no place for women in positions of authority. She later recalled, "I had more combat experience than any of the men who rejected my applications. I'd flown more missions than most of them had hours in their logbooks. But I was a woman, so I was told I'd be better suited to teaching children." It was heartbreaking. We'd been good enough to fight when the motherland was dying, but not good enough to serve when she was healing. When we measure the Night Witch's contribution to the Soviet war effort, we have to look beyond statistics. Yes, they flew 23,672 sorties. Yes, they dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs. Yes, they achieved tactical successes across the Eastern Front. But their real contribution was strategic. They tied down German air defenses, anti-aircraft batteries that could have been used against Soviet ground attack aircraft or bombers, were instead firing uselessly into the night sky at Po-2s. Searchlight units that could have illuminated targets for German bombers were focused on tracking biplanes. Fighter units wasted fuel and pilot hours attempting intercepts that rarely succeeded. They enabled Soviet ground operations. German forces operating in areas covered by night witches had degraded combat effectiveness due to sleep deprivation and constant stress. Soviet commanders learned to time offensives for dawn when German defenders were at their weakest after a night of bombardment. They provided a morale boost to Soviet forces. Knowing that women were flying combat missions over German lines inspired Soviet soldiers. If young women could face the fascists night after night, how could male soldiers do any less? The Night Witches became a symbol of Soviet determination, and symbols have power in war. They proved women could serve in combat roles. Before the 588th Regiment, female pilots were novelties. After 4 years of the Night Witches' operations, the debate was settled. Women could fly combat missions as effectively as men. This opened doors for female aviators in the post-war Soviet Air Force and influenced policies in other countries decades later. But perhaps most importantly, they scared the hell out of the Germans. That psychological impact can't be quantified, but it was real. Wehrmacht soldiers who had conquered Poland, France, and the Balkans, veterans who had survived the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, were terrorized by women in wooden biplanes. That's a victory that transcends any tactical consideration. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-02 biplane represent opposite ends of the aircraft design spectrum. One was the pinnacle of American industrial might, powerful, heavily armed, packed with advanced technology. The other was a 1928 training aircraft, simple, underpowered, constructed from the cheapest materials available. Yet both were devastating in their own ways. Both struck fear into enemy hearts. Both changed the course of the war. The lessons they teach are complementary, not contradictory. The Thunderbolt proved that overwhelming material superiority could break any enemy resistance. When you have better engines, better guns, better armor, better training, and better logistics, you can simply outlast and overpower your opponents. American industrial capacity built an aircraft so tough, so powerful, so well-armed that it could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters and still fight effectively. That's the Western way of war. use resources and technology to minimize casualties while maximizing enemy losses. The Po-2 proved that innovation and courage could compensate for material disadvantage. When you can't match enemy technology, you change the rules. You find dimensions where their advantages don't matter, and your unique capabilities become decisive. The Night Witches couldn't outfight German interceptors, so they didn't try. They found a way to avoid the fight entirely while still accomplishing their mission. That's the guerrilla way of war. Refuse to engage on enemy terms and create your own battlefield. Both approaches worked. Both were necessary. The Soviets needed Night Witches to harass German lines, but they also needed ground attack aircraft with heavy firepower to destroy enemy strongpoints. The Americans needed Thunderbolts to achieve air superiority, but they also needed reconnaissance aircraft and light bombers for specialized missions. Victory required both thunder and whisper, both roar and silence. What united these two very different aircraft was the people flying them, young men and women who found themselves in circumstances beyond their control and rose to meet impossible challenges. American farm boys who learned to aim locomotive engines at enemy fighters and squeeze triggers that unleashed walls of lead. Soviet women who learned to glide through darkness while anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky around them. Neither the P-47 pilots nor the Night Witches thought they were heroes. They thought they were doing what needed to be done. They were scared, exhausted, and traumatized. But they kept flying because the alternative was letting evil win. That's real heroism. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. On May 9, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The guns fell silent. The bombers landed. The fighters were parked. And the Po-2s of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment flew their final missions. The Night Witches could finally rest. Some of them returned to the lives they'd left in 1941. They married, raised families, built careers. Others found they couldn't go back. The war had changed them too fundamentally. They remained in aviation, teaching new generations of pilots, or they drifted, unable to find purpose in peacetime that matched what they'd felt in combat. All of them carried the war with them. In dreams, they still flew through darkness. In quiet moments, they still heard the whistle of wind through canvas wings. They still saw friends' faces, forever young, forever lost. They aged and died, one by one, until finally the last Night Witch passed away, and living memory became history. But history remembers. We remember the 23,672 sorties, the 3,000 tons of bombs, the 32 women who never came home, the hundreds who survived but carried scars deeper than skin. We remember because their story deserves remembering, because courage like theirs shouldn't be forgotten.